Welcome back. Still tuned in to News and Views with myself, Salailo Makwidiri. The time is 8:38, and the name of the show is News and Views, as I've mentioned. Or did I mention? I lose my train of thought sometimes. We're going to move on to one of my favorite segments is hashtag Africa Focus. This is where we look into a specific area of focus and of interest here on the continent, and we unpack all that is happening, all that you need to know about it, and most importantly, what's happening, what are the ins and outs of our continent, because sometimes we focus so much on what's happening across the world, that we forget that there's so much more happening right here on our doorstep, in Africa. And speaking of our doorstep, this story right here is one that is affecting us directly. The Southern African Development Community, or SADC for short, has officially decided to withdraw its troops from the Democratic Republic of Congo, marking the end of the SAMDEC, SAMIDRC mission. This decision comes in the wake of rising instability, the tragic deaths of SADC soldiers, and growing questions about the mission's effectiveness. But what does this withdrawal mean for regional security? Number one, also the balance of power in the DRC and also South Africa's military commitments. Was the mission doomed from the start, or could things have played out differently? And to help us break this all down, we're joined by Guy Martin. He's a journalist at defenceWeb who has been closely following these developments. Guy, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to Salam Media. Really appreciate you giving us your time this morning.
Good morning, and thanks very much for having me.
I think first and foremost, I want to touch on the mission fallout, and also this very, very important decision by SADC to withdraw troops. What would you say were some of the key factors that led SADC to withdraw from the DRC after being there for such a long time? I know this is specifically from the SADC mission. There are other missions that the SANDF is involved in, but this one particularly, from SADC, what were some of the key factors that led to this withdrawal?
Well, I would say the biggest factor was the military defeat on the battlefield. The M23 rebels, they basically scored a major victory over the SADC forces when they took Goma and Sake. The United Nations, they also suffered some personnel loss during the fighting around Sake and Goma at the end of January, but the SADC forces fared the worst. A total of 18 soldiers from South Africa, Tanzania, and Malawi were killed in those battles. And we've still got hundreds of SADC troops, including South African soldiers, who are effectively being held hostage under rebel control in the DRC. So that's a huge bargaining chip for the rebels. So militarily, there's very little that the SADC can offer to counter those rebels. And with soldiers essentially being held hostage, the M23 could have executed those soldiers if they felt threatened. They could have used them as bargaining chips. So I think if our troops weren't trapped and surrounded, that might have changed this decision to withdraw. But having said that, I don't think there was really much other option. Most parties agree that a diplomatic solution is the only way to go. President Cyril Ramaphosa has been adamant that the only real solution is diplomacy. So what's been holding up the process is that Felix Tshisekedi, the president of the DRC, he's been very reluctant to engage with the M23 and the Rwandan backers. So it's only recently that he's decided that he will engage in peace talks with the M23. And those are set to start tomorrow on the 18th. That process is partly brokered by Angola. So it's quite interesting that Angola and Zambia as well, they border the DRC, but neither of those countries, although they are SADC members, neither of them contributed troops to the SAMI DRC mission. there was only South Africa, Tanzania, Malawi who actually did contribute. So they went in with quite a weak force to start with. And that was one of the reasons why they were not able to achieve their objectives in the DRC, and why we are seeing the termination of the mission at the moment. I reckon if we were serious about defeating the M23, we would have gone in with at least double the manpower. The mandated strength of the SAMI-DRC mission was supposed to be about 5,000 troops, but less than that actually deployed. If you look at the United Nations, they had, they think that they peaked. They had about 20,000 soldiers in the DRC, and they were battling to bring the conflict under control. So, DRC with 5,000 troops, it was always going to be an uphill battle, and when those troops were not adequately equipped and supported, I mean, there's no way they could have achieved what they needed to. I mean, they didn't have air power, they lacked logistics, and at the same time, the M23 were getting stronger and better equipped. The M23, they were provided with surface-to-air missiles by Rwanda. They were provided with guided mortars. They were provided with quite sophisticated small arms, electronic warfare systems. There's been jamming of GPS signals in the area. So while the SANDF has been declining, the M23 were getting stronger. Another case in point is that the M23 took Goma back in 2012, and that prompted a big deployment and response by the United Nations, which set up its Force Intervention Brigade. When South Africa started taking part in that Force Intervention Brigade, in 2013 we sent Royal Falcon attack helicopters to the DRC, and they were extremely effective at combating the M23 rebels. So when the Royal Falcons first went up, nearly 15 years ago now, the M23 came to the negotiating table within a week of the first Royal Falcon airstrikes. So that was back then when South Africa was stronger, the UN was stronger, had a bigger presence, and the M23 was much weaker. And in the last decade, the M23 have taken the opportunity to regroup, strengthen, rearm, and the SANDF has been in decline. It's gone backwards. And also something else that might have played a role is, Rwanda supports the M23, and Rwanda was also active in Mozambique while South Africa was part of the SADC mission in Mozambique, along with several other SADC countries. Rwandan troops were in Mozambique to combat terrorism in Cabo Delgado under a separate bilateral relationship with Mozambique. Now, the Rwandan troops would have seen South African soldiers operating. They would be able to get an idea of their equipment, tactics, and so forth. And I suspect that knowledge informed how the battles in the DRC played out, because a lot of that intelligence that would have been gathered by the Rwandans would have been passed on to the M23. And I think the Rwandans saw that the SA National Defense Force is not as strong as it used to be. And I'm sure the M23 used that knowledge to their advantage.
South Africa has been in Rwanda for almost 20 years. I think since 1999. The SNDF has been involved in the DRC. There's been billions and billions that has been invested in that region. Can we say this was a mission failed? Is this how we can just encapsulate everything that you have mentioned? This has been a failed mission by the SNDF. Billions have been wasted. I think just recently there was an announcement that almost 5 billion had been allocated for this mission alone. What happens now? What happens to the funding? Do we recall all SNDF troops and call it a day? And ultimately, what does this signal for South Africa as a powerhouse on the continent, and for the SANDF, who have done well, in other parts of the continent? The Central African Republic comes to mind. There's been missions also, to Burundi, Mozambique. Also, we've had our troops there. But ultimately, what does this say about the SANDF and its prowess as a military power on the continent?
I think it clearly marks the end of South Africa being a big brother that is often seen to be on the continent. It's clear that South Africa does not have the sway, the weight, the strength to carry out these missions, to intervene militarily. We were essentially defeated by 15,000 strong rebel force, backed up by perhaps 5,000 to 6,000 Rwandan soldiers. Rwanda's a tiny country compared to us, and yet they were able to arrange essentially a defeat. So I think there's no way that South Africa can continue to carry out such deployments. We're going to have to take a very hard look at the state of our military, what we want to do and what we're actually able to do. Because there's this big discrepancy between what the SANDF is told to do and asked to do and what it can actually do. The Defence Force has estimated it's underfunded by at least 50%. It lacks the manpower, it lacks the equipment, it lacks the logistics support, it lacks serviceable equipment. Most Air Force platforms are grounded. Most Navy ships cannot go to sea. So it's impossible to run a war nearly 3,000 kilometers from home when you just don't have the resources to do so. So the politicians need to be aware of that, and they need to acknowledge that they can't just keep giving the SANDF one task after another and not giving it funding. There were a lot of talks by, for example, Deputy Minister Bantu Holomisa, that Ramaphosa would increase the defense budget to 1.5% of GDP. Last week's defense budget showed that did not happen. The defense budget is about 0.8% of GDP. So last week's increase was about 400 million rand, which was not enough to keep with inflation. So essentially the defense budget has shrunk in real terms once again. Meanwhile, the SANDF is given extra responsibilities. It's tasked with supporting the United Nations mission in the DRC and the SADC mission, as well as supplying about 1,000 plus soldiers for border security. There's been more flooding in KZN. It's often tasked to do disaster relief. And there's just no way that the SANDF can do all this. So I think this is one of the main reasons why the SANDF or why the SADC mission in the DRC failed. But one shouldn't blame it entirely on the SANDF. The SANDF contributed the majority of SAMI DRC troops, but they were supposed to be supporting the FARDC, the DRC government forces. And when the M23 rebels started approaching Goma, a lot of those government forces, they fled, they gave up, they changed into civilian clothing. Their morale was low, they were badly trained, terribly equipped. Some of their tanks only had 3 rounds of ammunition in them. So they were let down quite significantly by the DRC government troops. And the troops from Tanzania, Malawi, there were far fewer of them. So once things started falling apart, I mean, there was only so much the South Africans could do. And from what I understand, the South African soldiers on the ground, they performed very well under the circumstances. And I think if they had been given the right equipment and air support, maybe the battle would have gone another way.
think we're going to leave on that note, Guy. Thank you so much for joining us and giving us your time this morning. Really, really appreciate it.
You're most welcome, and thanks again for having me.
There you go. That was Guy Martin, editor at defenceWeb, and really, really unpacking, I think, nicely SADC pulling out of the DRC, that regional mission nearing its end. Can we consider it a failure? Guy seems to think so. He thinks South Africa has lost its place as the proverbial big brother on the continent, and this is mainly because the SANDF is not properly funded, it's not properly equipped, although our troops, are doing exceptionally well under the circumstances and under, limited resources that they have. They can only do so much. They're stretched, budgets are limited, and ultimately this sees South Africa losing its place as a powerhouse on the continent when it comes to our military and what interventions we can make. And I think that's a bitter pill to swallow, because I think we've always prided ourselves on having a really effective military. It's the NCNDF was for the most part the pride and joy of South Africans, particularly after 1994, because we know pre-apartheid what was the story there. But with that being said, I think it's a bitter pill to swallow, hearing that, and you can almost see it, man. It's the SANDF doesn't have that look and feel about it. Have you noticed it also? What do you make? What do you make of our troops? What do you make of the SANDF and South Africa's role on the continent? Should our government continue sending our troops to neighboring countries, for peacekeeping missions, for disaster, mitigation efforts, or should we focus internally? There's been calls for the SANDF to be deployed in parts of the Western Cape. Should that maybe be, top of the agenda? Should that be a priority, securing our porous borders? The KZN, you heard from Guy, and we've all seen it ourselves, the disasters that are happening in that part of the world, that part of the country. Should maybe the South African National Defence Force be streamlined on those efforts, because it seems we just can't do it anymore on the continent. We don't have, although the willingness is there, but it just seems like we don't have the resources, we don't have the prowess, and the just the power, the might to do it anymore. What do you think? Should we focus more internally, or should the government make sure that we rebuild the SANDF and make sure that it reclaims its place on the continent? You can engage with us on WhatsApp. Our line is 061-766-0355, and our studio line is 011-680-0355. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to be having a really interesting conversation with one of South Africa's rising hockey stars, Malaika. She's I think one of the most brilliant hockey players I've seen in a while. Malaika Hamza, she's an international sports prodigy, and we'll be talking to her about faith, fasting, and the beautiful game of hockey and how she fell in love with it. So it's going to be an interesting one after this break.